Well, my name is John Shaw. I'm the director of the Simon Institute and would like to welcome you here for another great event. I see familiar faces from last week where we had an interesting speaker, Ira Shapiro, who talked about statesmanship at the federal level primarily. And Ira's argument was that the U.S. Senate, among other things, was not really serving as a mediator to resolve national problems and calm things. And I think events of the last week or so have not undermined his thesis that the Senate is not perhaps the institution that is serving the country in the best way. But today we want to move home and actually move into a little more positive ground and focus on statesmanship in Illinois history. And I think the perfect person to talk about statesmanship in Illinois history is our speaker, Dr. Sam Wheeler. Sam Wheeler is the 10th. Well, actually, before I say a word about that, I want to just make note of the fact that Sam's parents made a special effort to come here from Springfield tonight. So I told them that they earned... I told him that they earned Parent of the Year awards for making the trip down, and I know Sam was surprised and appreciative to see them, so that's great to have them here. Sam is the 10th Illinois state historian. He's a native of Springfield, and his particular interest is Illinois history, Civil War history, and Abraham Lincoln. In fact, his PhD dissertation was on the poetry of Abraham Lincoln, which he did here at SIU Carbondale. Before that, he has an undergraduate degree from ISU and a master's from the University of Illinois Springfield. I was telling Sam that I think if we can get honorary degrees from Eastern, Western, and Northern, it would help flesh out his Illinois credentials a little bit. But Sam is a remarkable man. I've had a chance to meet with him on a couple of occasions, wide-ranging interests. He's been a historian on every level, from delving into the archives to giving tours of the Illinois State Capitol and the Lincoln Law Offices. So Sam is going to give us sort of an overview about statesmanship, high-level leadership in Illinois history. He's going to speak for as long as he wants, and then he and I are going to sit up here and talk for a few minutes, and then we really encourage a lot of conversation from the audience. So with that, I'd like to introduce Sam to step forward. Okay.
It banged again. That's really interesting. Thank you so much, John, for that nice introduction. Thank you all for being here. This is fantastic. It's wonderful to be back in Carbondale. I haven't been back in too long because as I pulled into campus the other day, I, of course, was in the history department, so I was spent all my time in Feiner Hall. The only place I knew really where to park was the parking garage outside Feiner Hall. And I found a beautiful student services building there instead. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's got to be a new building. It says 2013 on it. That makes sense. I turned around and I was going to look at the football stadium and it wasn't there. You guys have done a lot of stuff since I left 8 years ago. That seems like it doesn't seem like it was that long, but my goodness, 8 years, I guess, is a long time. So thanks again for being here. John, thank you so much for inviting me back. This is fantastic. It is a particular honor for me to be speaking as part of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. I have great respect for Senator Simon, and I was fortunate enough to meet him one time in 2003. He spoke to a graduate seminar that I was part of that Professor John Y. Simon was teaching at the time, a course on, I think it was a Civil War history, Abraham Lincoln seminar. And of course, Senator Paul Simon wrote the book on Mr. Lincoln's time in the Illinois State Legislature. So it was a perfect opportunity to have him come speak to our class. But I want to tell you about that interaction. It was 2003. The wounds of 9/11 were still fresh in everybody's mind. The United States had just launched a war against Iraq. And Senator Simon told our class, that wars were not the answer to defeating hateful ideology. He said instead of dropping bombs, the United States should increase its expenditure of foreign economic aid in the Middle East. Now, in 2003, when the United States has just launched a war, it's not a particularly popular idea to be throwing around. Today, it's still not a popular idea to be throwing around, right? But he went on to tell us that there were, in 2003 anyway, 100 million children around the world who didn't go to school. He said that those madrasas in the Middle East that preached hate instead of teaching math and science sprung up because those governments weren't providing education for their students. He said in 2003, the United States spent 0.5% of its budget on foreign economic aid. Of that, 1/3 went to Israel and Egypt to maintain stability, and he suggested massively increasing that expenditure of foreign aid. He then went on, he transitioned immediately to talk about study abroad programs. He said that at that point in time, in 2003, there were 584,000 international students enrolled in colleges and universities in the United States. He said only about 1% of United States students study abroad, and 2/3 of those students study in Western Europe, whereas 95% of the growth in terms of world population would, over the next 50 years, would take place outside of Western Europe. He told us that it was a matter of foreign policy. It was a matter of national defense, that the United States should drastically increase that number, because he believed the best export that we have in America are our young people, our students going around the world. Let the rest of the world meet Americans, and let Americans understand the rest of the world. He was there talking to our class. It was part of his book tour for the last book he ever wrote, Our Culture of Pandering. Has anybody ever read that? I challenge you all, go out and read that book. It's a great experience. It still holds up. I recently went back through it. His thesis in that book is that too many politicians in 2003 practice followership. They don't practice leadership. What he means by that is politicians, when they're looking at a certain issue, as they're trying to carve out their position on it, you know what they do? They look at public opinion polls. And they decide then, based on the pulse of the nation, where the nation wants them to go, because their reelection is going to depend on it, they then carve out what's their position. And he says this is directly the opposite of what they should be doing. They should be true leaders. There's a great passage in his book. I'll read it to you here quickly. He says, quote, "We have spawned leadership that does not lead. It panders to our whims rather than telling us the truth. It follows the crowd rather than challenging us. And that weakens us rather than strengthening us. It's easy to go downhill, and we are now following that easy path. Pandering is not illegal, but it is immoral. It's doing the convenient thing when the right course demands inconvenience and courage. Leaders in all areas, including politics, media, religion, and education, are guilty of pandering, of giving in to what is easy instead of fighting for what is right." So in the aftermath of 9/11 and at the beginning of the Iraq War, I got to see, SIU students got to see up close a statesman in action. He didn't tell us what he thought we wanted to hear that night. He told us what he thought we needed to hear that night. That made an impression on me then, and as I was preparing to speak as part of the institute named after him, those memories kind of came flooding back. Today, I hear a lot of people say, we're starved for real leadership. Over the last 200 years of Illinois history, this is the bicentennial of Illinois history. As the state historian of Illinois, I have spoken all over this state on a bunch of different topics. Over the last 200 years, Illinois has had thousands of politicians. I don't know what the exact number is, but think about it. Politicians in the state legislature, in the governor's office, all the way down to school boards, et cetera, on the local level. We've had thousands and thousands of politicians. But I think it's safe to say we've only had a handful of statesmen. Think about what the difference is between a politician and a statesman. There is a difference. Politicians, they're easily swayed. What are the things that easily sway a politician? How about partisanship? They obey, for the most part, their party bosses. They determine how to vote on issues based on their party's instructions. If they obey the party, they get to rise through the ranks of their party system. They're swayed by polls. As Professor Simon told us, politicians too often practice followership instead of leadership. They're also swayed by popularity. Politicians are always concerned with the next election. They'll often do or say anything to get reelected. That's job security. Woodrow Wilson once said, if you think too much about being reelected, it's difficult to do anything worth being reelected. So conversely, how are statesmen, how do they make decisions? They make their decisions on principles, firm, unchanging, fundamental truths. Truths like all men are created equal. Statesmen have challenged us to live up to those immortal words in the Declaration of Independence. John Addams said, always stand on principle, even if you stand alone. That's one of the lessons of statesmanship. It can be lonely. You can risk not being reelected. You can risk the short-term abuse of the media, your colleagues, not being reelected, you're deemed a failure. But here's the one promise in statesmanship. If you practice it, history will look kindly on you. Statesmen they also have a vision for the future of the country. Politicians, they're worried about the next election, but a statesman is concerned about the next generation. That's the prism through which they filter these decisions. And then, of course, if they have a good vision, how are they going to implement that vision? The power of persuasion. A statesman usually has the ability to be a wonderful writer and a wonderful speaker. A statesman doesn't rely on slick PR campaigns or attack ads. Those won't stand the test of time. But their words, rooted in principle, will. So at Springfield, at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, that's where I spend my normal work days. We unveiled a new exhibit for the bicentennial called From Illinois to the White House. It focuses on the 4 presidents who called Illinois home. You know who they are? Abraham Lincoln's one of them, right? Who's the second one? Ulysses S. Grant. We claim him. Didn't spend a whole lot of time in Illinois, but we claim him. That was an important year in his life. Who else? Ronald Reagan. And then, of course, Barack Obama, our 4 presidents. It's going to be up through the end of the year. I encourage you to check it out. It was an important exhibit for us to put up during the bicentennial because we wanted to remind folks what a rich tradition Illinoisans are a part of. We had 4 individuals make it to the White House. Now, you can debate if all of those 4 individuals are statesmen or not. That's fine. That's a good task for you to have here at the Bicentennial. That's a good conversation. Illinois history contains all sorts of contenders for that title of statesmanship. I'll run down a few of these. You can make up your own mind. Are these statesmen or are these politicians? Maybe these politicians had statesman-like moments, but maybe you wouldn't consider them in that statesmanship hall of fame, right? How about Stephen A. Douglas? He's a hard one. One of the most famous senators in his lifetime, did so influential in terms of the 19th century. Did he rise above the prejudices of his life that occurred during his lifetime? Probably not. John A. Logan, a lot of people love him down here. I know all about it. Did Dirty Work Logan rise above the prejudices of his lifetime? Some would say he certainly did by the end of his life. On my Mount Rushmore of significant Illinoisans, Jane Addams is on there for sure. Can we consider her a statesman? She wasn't elected to office, right? Did she influence Illinois politicians through her reform efforts? Maybe. How about Lyman Trumbull, a name you don't remember in terms of Illinois history? He's the author of the 13th Amendment. How about Owen Lovejoy, stood beside his brother as he was murdered for his abolitionist beliefs, and up until the last day of his life in 1864, fought valiantly to see the end of American slavery. William Jennings Bryan. How about Henry Horner, the governor who led Illinois through the Great Depression? Paul Douglas, an advocate for civil rights, an advocate of the Marshall Plan after World War II. Everett Dirksen. Folks may remember Mr. Dirksen. He helped write and pass the landmark Civil Rights Act of 64 and 68, and a name you can't escape in terms of Illinois history. What about Adlai Stevenson? Famously didn't focus on those those popularity polls, but he challenged America to be a reasonable force of good in the world. You're free to argue these, and I know that you're thinking of many other figures in Illinois history. You could add to the list. As I said, that's a good exercise to do during the Bicentennial. But tonight, I want to devote the rest of my time to three individuals. Some of these folks you may not think of in terms of statesmen in Illinois history. One of them I know that you know about, but there's some acts I want to highlight that maybe aren't on the forefront of your radar. So first off, let's rewind the clock. We're in 2018. Let's go back to the time before Illinois even became a state. The Northwest Ordinance banned slavery from the territory, those territories that would be carved out and new states would emerge. The idea from the founders was that this territory in the Northwest would have an opportunity to perfect itself, to not be poisoned with that scourge of slavery. As new states would be carved out of that territory, they'd be admitted as free states, but that did not stop territorial governments from allowing slavery in by another name. The Illinois Territory was formed in 1809. They allowed the French in Illinois, who had been having their slaves here since the 17th century, to keep their slaves. And a system we call voluntary servitude emerged, where we're not going to call them slaves, but we will have servants who would sign indenture contracts with their masters in Illinois. Sometimes these indenture contracts were 99 years long. Sometimes it bound their children to the terms of the contract. These contracts could be bought and sold in Illinois. Sounds a lot like slavery, right? It's pseudo-slavery. It's slavery by another name. Ninian Edwards, a name you may have heard about. Ninian Edwards was the first territorial governor of Illinois. He's not a statesman in my mind. He owns slaves. He buys and sells indentured servants in the Illinois Territory. He uses his power to benefit himself, to add to his personal wealth. As territorial governor, he used his veto power one time. He vetoed a bill that would have abolished indentured servitude in the Illinois Territory. Illinois became a state in 1818. The United States Congress, as part of the statehood process, you'd have to write a state constitution, you'd submit it to the United States Congress, and they would have to approve it. If it's going to be a pro-slavery constitution, Congress is going to kick it back. You're in violation of the Northwest Ordinance. The Illinois Constitution of 1818, which is on display in Springfield in our From Illinois to the White House exhibit, it was the law of the land for 30 years in Illinois. But that document allowed owners of indentured servants to keep them. But their children would be free once they reached adulthood. So maybe there's a form of gradual emancipation worked into that first constitution. It says that no new indenture contracts could be entered into, and Illinoisans could bring slaves into the state to work in places like the salt mines in southern Illinois. Shadrach Bond, the first elected governor of Illinois. Shadrach Bond, isn't that a great name? It's a name you'll never forget. The first elected governor of Illinois, he was a slave owner. In 1819, Illinois passed restrictive black codes, ensuring that African Americans in Illinois had no civil rights. In 1820, Illinois had a great deal in common with states in the South. The Illinois population at that time, about 75% of Illinoisans, all in southern Illinois for the most part, 75% of the population had been born south of the Mason-Dixon line. In 1820, Missouri entered the Union as a full-fledged slave state. That was the first state to be carved out of the old Louisiana Purchase territory. Some folks in Illinois said, man, these Missouri folks got it pretty good. They got carved out of the Louisiana Purchase territory. They can have slavery. We had to adhere to the principles in the Northwest Ordinance. We had to enter in as a free state, even though we've got some caveats in there. But momentum begins to build on the ground in Illinois. Now that we've attained statehood, what's stopping us from calling a constitutional convention? Rewriting a constitution that maybe will look like Missouri's, where we can have a full-fledged slave state here. And pro-slavery members of the Illinois legislature determined to do just that. And so, enter the first statesman in Illinois history. Edward Coles had a life of privilege. He was born in Virginia. His father was a wealthy plantation owner. He had owned slaves. His family was friends with Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe. His family was related to Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife. He was educated at the College of William and Mary, and that's where he became a secret abolitionist. He's influenced by these ideas, but he doesn't let out that he's an abolitionist because he wants to keep his inheritance. His dad's going to die soon. He's going to inherit a huge plantation with slaves. If he lets the cat out of the bag here that he's an abolitionist, his dad's not going to give him those slaves. When he inherits a 782-acre plantation, it comes with 17 slaves. He sells the plantation, and he takes those 17 slaves with him as he travels here to Illinois. On the way here, he tells them, "You're free." He buys each of the heads of the family a farm of their own. He says, "Anybody who wants to come work on my farm, I'll pay you a wage." When Coles arrives in Illinois, this is the time where he hears this plot to call a constitutional convention and to try to make Illinois a full-fledged slave state. He's not a politician, but he decides then and there, I'm going to run for governor, and I'm going to stop this. In 1822, he runs for governor. 4 people are on the ticket. 2 are pro-slavery individuals. They're going to bring a new constitution that's slave-friendly to Illinois. Coles is the only one who's anti-slavery. The other one's kind of a neutral candidate. The pro-slavery forces split the vote. And so Coles becomes governor, the second governor of Illinois, with just 33% of the popular vote in his pocket. He's not a trained politician, and so he gives a very reckless inaugural address. He's aggressive. He calls for the immediate end of indentured servitude in Illinois. He calls for the freeing of all the French slaves and indentured servants and their children. He says we've got to revise the black codes. He even talks about these nasty things you see in the paper and you see repeated by abolitionists in the 19th century. These stories that free African Americans are kidnapped in southern Illinois, and they're sold into slavery further to the south. He says we need to bring an immediate end to this, and we need to provide safeguards for these individuals. Now, his inaugural address is not really well received. The pro-slavery faction declares war on Governor Coles. They immediately call for a constitutional convention to take place during the presidential election of 1824, put this measure on the ballot when folks are going in to vote for president, and by a popular vote, Illinoisans can determine in 1824 if they want to have a constitutional convention or not. It's just going to go down to a popular vote. Coles, in his mind, he determines, in principle, slavery is wrong. In principle, it goes against everything of the Northwest Ordinance. It goes against the very ideals of the nation. He donates his entire 4-year salary as governor towards fighting this initiative. He writes addresses to the people of Illinois trying to convince them that this is not the right route to go. He gets 15 members of the legislature to sign his petition to not have this constitutional convention go through. He recruits anti-slavery speakers from the East to help out. He buys a newspaper, the Illinois Intelligencer, the newspaper that was the driving force behind statehood. He turns it into an abolitionist newspaper. He uses all the powers of persuasion that he can muster to form a consensus. And during the election of 1824, Illinoisans vote 6,640 versus 4,972 not to have a constitutional convention, not to put Illinois on this path towards slavery. It's a significant moment in Illinois history. It's a significant moment in American history. Could you imagine if Illinois turned into a slave state? How would that influence immigration patterns over the next century? I mean, the rest of Illinois history is so vibrant because you have another culture that begins to populate Illinois. We get migration in from the Northeast, and that's where we settled the northern part of Illinois. I think if we had gone as a slave state, you would have seen that southern migration up to the state, and it would have been so different. After this victory, Coles asks the legislature to formally outlaw indentured servitude. The legislature doesn't do that. They vow to ruin him, and that's pretty much what they do. He's not reelected to another term. Years later, he even tries to run for Congress. He finishes a distant third. If you were one of his contemporaries, you might say that's a failed politician. It's a guy who didn't get reelected, a guy who lost his core constituency. He ultimately leaves Illinois. He moves to Philadelphia, but he lives long enough. He lives until 1868 to see the fruits of everything that he fought for. I got to imagine when he's in Philadelphia and he's reading the newspapers, he probably has to feel justified. An Illinoisan, as President of the United States, presides over the death of slavery. An Illinoisan, Lyman Trumbull, authors the 13th Amendment, constitutionally destroying slavery, and Illinois becomes the first state in the Union to ratify the 13th Amendment. All right. Second, I want to tell you about another aspect of statesmanship. And here it is. I don't think statesmen are simply born. They don't fall out of the sky ready to lead. Sometimes they start out as common politicians. They evolve into statesmen. Most politicians never make it that far, by the way. It takes a special politician to evolve into a statesman. And the most famous Illinoisan there's ever been, and I'm going to say will ever be, is a great example of this phenomenon. As a young politician in the Illinois legislature, Abraham Lincoln was intensely partisan. I bet you haven't heard that a whole lot of times. Abraham Lincoln, as a member of the legislature, wasn't above rolling in the mud in election time. He wasn't above demonizing his opponents on the stump or in anonymous editorials in the newspaper. Could you believe such a despicable thing? Abraham Lincoln behaved in a very un-Lincoln-esque way as a young man in the legislature. But that being said, he showed signs that he was capable of something more. And I want to tell you about one of these. In early 1837, Illinois Governor Joseph Duncan received a number of pleas from his counterparts in southern states. Slavery had the power to tear the nation apart, they said, and it was up to level-headed men presiding over good governments to make sure that the country remained united. In 1831, the Nat Turner Rebellion put the fear of God in the southern states. Abolitionists emerged. These are the troublemakers. These are the guys putting these ideas into these obedient slaves' heads. For everybody's sake, these southern governors said, North and South, they wanted northern governments like Illinois to pass resolutions. Remind your people what this nation is all about. We want to have long-term stability. We want to have good relations. And to do that, remind your folks that abolitionists are the enemies of law and order. Remind your folks the Constitution allows slavery. So Illinois Governor Joseph Duncan asks the Illinois legislature to do just that. The Illinois legislature formed a committee, and a name, again, you probably haven't heard, Orville Browning from Quincy. He's a Whig senator. He's Lincoln's roommate in the boarding house. He's a member of his own political party. He lives with Lincoln in the boarding house in Vandalia. He chairs the committee. The committee works. They draft 3 resolutions. They go like this. First, the Illinois legislature condemns abolitionists. Abolitionist societies, it's bad news. Abolitionism, calling for the immediate emancipation and equal rights for white and blacks, it's not practical. Abolitionists, this resolution says, you do more harm than good. Second, the Illinois legislature supports our brothers in the South. We support Southern slaveholders. Because the United States Constitution protects slavery, it's up to states to determine if they want slavery or not abolitionist troublemakers. And third, the Illinois legislature is critical of abolitionist desires to end slavery in Washington, D.C., a pet peeve of abolitionists in the early 19th century through the Civil War. And this gives you an insight into Illinois' population at this point in time, in 1837. The resolutions passed both houses of Congress overwhelmingly. In the House, they passed 77-6. In the Senate, it's unanimous, 18-0. What's remarkable is that 27-year-old Abraham Lincoln is a member of the legislature. He's one of the 6 guys who voted against those resolutions. It's the first indication we have in history that Lincoln is capable of statesmanship. He goes further, and Paul Simon talks about this in his book about Lincoln as a legislator. I never knew this until I read this in Paul Simon's book. Paul Simon talks about how unique Mr. Lincoln's next step is. He voted against these resolutions. At the end of the term, he issued a protest statement. He goes further. He wants to put it on the record why he voted against these. He issues a protest statement on these resolutions. He says, first off, he believes the institution of slavery is founded on both injustice and bad policy. Second, he says abolitionists tend rather to increase than to abate slavery's evils. It's the first time Lincoln's ever gone on record talking about the slavery issue. He hates slavery, but he's no fan of abolitionists. Because, in his mind, abolitionists short-circuit the political process. In his mind, at this point in time, it's so critical to work within the political process to find change in America. He's beginning to carve out a really complicated position on the slavery issue. And that complicated position, by the way, leads to the death of American slavery. That's why it's so significant. So from a young age, we see a glimpse. Lincoln, we said, is the most famous Illinois statesman. There's a bunch of examples of this. Here's a couple. During the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, everybody's talking about what's slavery's fate in the new territories. Stephen Douglas, the most famous member of the legislature, he's in the Senate. He has a solution for the problem of slavery: popular sovereignty. What's more democratic than that? We can just ask a local government to hold an election and let's vote up or down. Do you want slavery in your territory or not? But Lincoln says that slavery, it's a moral issue. It's contrary to everything America was founded on. We should do everything in our power to limit its evil and put it on the road towards ultimate extinction. Don't put it up to a popular vote and potentially breathe new life into this horrible institution. Lincoln doesn't get to the Senate in 1858. Douglas prevails, but by deferring electoral success in 1858, that puts him on the path towards success in 1860 when he becomes president. One of my favorite examples of Lincoln's statesmanship is during the Secession Crisis. Lincoln's statesmanship is on full display. After he's elected, 7 states secede from the Union. Many people said then, and at the presidential library, I get this comment all the time: why didn't he just let them go? Because we know what comes next: a horrible civil war over the next 4 years that claims 2% of the American population. There's not a community that escaped that horrible conflict. Why not just let them go? Why not just let them form their own nation and we can move forward? It's because Lincoln believed there was an important principle at stake, a principle that you can't overlook. In his mind, the fate of free government hung in the balance. Because in 1860, a free and fair election had taken place. He ran against 3 other individuals. He wins the popular vote by 39.9% of the electorate. He wins the election through the Electoral College, certainly. If you let the South go, what does that mean for the fate of democracy? It says that those kings and emperors and czars and dictators were right. People can't govern themselves. A free and fair election had taken place. Half the nation didn't like the result, so they left. Democracy hangs in the balance. Lincoln told his contemporaries, "We cannot escape history. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth." He's talking about democracy. And so in his mind, the Civil War is a struggle to test whether or not the experiment in popular government would continue. What's remarkable is that victory is not inevitable. The casualties mounted, and my God, the criticism mounted. Today, we're blinded by Lincoln's this saint. We figure he's the most famous American and popular American ever. Reality is he's one of the most hated individuals during his lifetime. try to stand up to that withering criticism every day. And Lincoln stood firm on principles. He's a statesman. And then finally, on April 11th, 1865, the last public speech of his life, delivered from a window in the White House with his little boy sitting at his feet, catching the papers as he reads them as they fall to the ground. It's 2 days after Robert E. Lee's surrender, the virtual end of the American Civil War. Lincoln gives a speech where he foreshadows what Reconstruction is going to look like. Emancipation had already occurred. Congress had passed the 13th Amendment. Illinois was the first state, as we said, to ratify the amendment. It's a foregone conclusion: slavery's dead and it's not coming back. But in this speech, for the first time in his public life, Lincoln calls for voting rights for African Americans. He calls for voting rights to the very intelligent and those who had served our nation. It's the first time an American president had ever advocated for voting rights for African Americans. Lincoln was signaling that civil rights was going to be a critical component for emancipation to be meaningful. That's a radical idea for folks to hear in 1865. Lincoln's assassin was in the crowd. He heard that speech. When Lincoln utters that sentence, he turns to a companion, and I'll spare you the language, but he says something to the effect, "That's it, I'm going to kill him." Kills him 3 days later. Statesmanship sometimes has tragic consequences. Lincoln is a perfect example of that. We talked about not getting reelected, being demonized, and of course, assassination. Statesmanship is not for the weak. Last example I want to give you, and then we can open it up to a larger discussion. I want to leave you with one more example of an Illinois statesman from a different time period, late in the 19th century. John Peter Altgeld. He's born in Germany. He immigrated to the United States when he was only 3 months old. He fought in the Civil War in an Ohio regiment, didn't see any combat, but he almost died of disease. He became a successful lawyer, moved to Chicago, made a bunch of money in real estate. He had an interest in politics, but like Edward Coles, he's not a professional politician. He's not well seasoned. He wrote a book that was very critical of the American justice system. He wrote a book where, this sounds pretty familiar, that he argued that our criminal justice system did not reform criminals. It only produced hardened, wiser criminals. He was very interested in progressive reforms. In 1892, he was elected the 20th governor of Illinois, the first Democrat elected governor of Illinois since 1856, the first foreign-born citizen to be elected governor of Illinois, the first Chicago resident ever elected governor of Illinois. And he proved to be a genuine in terms of progressive reform for the state. He signed the nation's most progressive child labor laws, the nation's most progressive workplace safety laws. He was in favor of the women's 8-hour workday, and he vastly increased state funding for higher education. You go to public universities in Illinois, you'll see a building on campus probably called Altgeld Hall. You guys have one, right? Music department, is that right? That's what it was back in my day. I don't remember if it's still that. But in 1893, he made a very controversial, some would say a statesman-like move. The Haymarket bombing had occurred in 1886. The result of Chicago's industrial workforce demonstrating for better workplace condition. A time in Chicago, think about this, where 2/3 of the population was first or second generation immigrant. A bomb went off during a labor dispute demonstration. The public is outraged in the aftermath. They're frightened. A grand jury hands down a 69-count indictment against 8 of these labor leaders. The prosecutors concede during this 54-day trial that none of the 8 folks who are standing trial threw the bomb. But by being reckless with their language, they created the conditions for the bomb thrower to do his work. One of the accused received life in prison, and 7 others received the death penalty. One committed suicide while he was waiting to be executed, and 4 were eventually hanged. Any casual observer saw a miscarriage of justice. Celebrated attorneys spoke out. Clarence Darrow, the novelist William Dean Howells, poet and playwright Oscar Wilde spoke out. In 1893, Governor Altgeld intervened. He didn't grant clemency to the 3 individuals remaining. He didn't grant clemency based on the grounds of mercy. Instead, he issued a full pardon. He called them victims of, quote, hysteria, packed juries, and a biased judge. Altgeld said the legal system failed to protect the rights of Americans. The next year, 1894, during the Pullman strike, Altgeld again took the side of labor. He opposed President Grover Cleveland's use of federal troops to put down the strike. When Cleveland sent in 8,000 federal troops, casualties resulted. Altgeld spoke out, even though they were members of the same party. Teddy Roosevelt, when he swung around and spoke to 13,000 folks in Chicago, he condemned Altgeld, as he said that Altgeld, quote, condones and encourages the most infamous of murderers. How'd you like somebody to say that about you? That'd be bad, wouldn't it? In 1896, Altgeld wasn't reelected as governor of Illinois. By standing up for labor, he had alienated capital. Altgeld was later defeated when he tried to run for mayor of Chicago. That's a statesmanship lesson. Taking a statesmanship stand can cost you a lot. But what did we say earlier? That history often remembers you kindly. JFK's Profiles in Courage in 1956 praised Altgeld's act of what he called political courage by pardoning the Haymarket folks. And today, history sees Altgeld as a defender of labor, defender of the individual against entrenched power. And I love this line. One of his biographers said that Altgeld added justice to America's industrial society. Beautiful epitaph for Altgeld. Oftentimes, artists and poets are more forward-thinking than the voters. The great Illinois poet Vachel Lindsay wrote a eulogy to John Peter Altgeld. It's a beautiful poem. It's also a fitting tribute to what we've been talking about tonight, statesmen, especially those who don't always get the honor they deserve during their lifetime. So think about some of these things we've talked. I want to read you this poem. It's called The Eagle That Is Forgotten. Sleep softly, eagle forgotten, under the stone. Time has its way with you there, and the clay has its own. We have buried him now, thought your foes, and in secret rejoiced. They made a brave show of their mourning, their hatred unvoiced. They had snarled at you. They barked at you. They foamed at you day after day. Now you were ended. They praised you, and they laid you away. The others that mourned you in silence and terror and truth, the widow bereft of her crust and the boy without youth, the mocked and the scorned and wounded, the lame and the poor that should have remembered forever, remember no more. Where are those lovers of yours? On that name do they call, the lost, that in armies wept over your funeral pall? They call on the names of 100 high valiant ones. 100 white eagles have risen, the sons of your sons. The zeal in their wings is a zeal that your dreaming began. The valor that wore out your soul in the service of man. Sleep softly, eagle forgotten, under the stone. Time has its way with you there, and the clay has its own. Sleep on, O brave-hearted, O wise man that kindled the flame. To live in mankind is far more than to live in a name. To live in mankind is far more than to live in a name. The world needs more poets. We need more Vachel Lindsays. We need more Edward Coles and John Peter Altgelds. So, to wrap up here, politics, it's an ugly business. I was thinking about this the other day as I was trying to think how to wrap this up. I've got a 6-year-old little boy at home. I teach him not to do the very things our politicians do. Don't argue. Don't call people names. Don't lie. Our politicians behave in a way that would earn them a timeout in most first grade classrooms. In Illinois, we live with the added reality that 4 of our last 7 governors have gone to prison. I've talked to so many people just this year in bicentennial talks who are disappointed in politics, politicians, and the entire political process, and that's not good. It leads people to do things like not voting. They believe their vote doesn't matter, all the politicians are the same, doesn't matter who wins. What a shame. So, my bicentennial dream for all you Illinoisans, we need fewer politicians and more statesmen. I think we all agree. So how can we make that a reality? Here's some things we can do. I think it starts with each of us. First off, I challenge you to become an active participant in life, not just a passive observer. What does that mean? How about we unplug our TV every once in a while? Step away from the cable political news channels where really it's just people screaming at each other, right? Or they're telling you what you should think. Get out and experience the world around you. You'll see where the world is at and maybe where it needs to go. Second off, I challenge you to rediscover America. Read about the founding of America. What was the American Revolution? Why was it a revolutionary form of government? What was America supposed to be? How did that differ from the rest of the world? Reread the Constitution. That's a brilliant document. I bet you there's somebody sitting here today who hasn't read the Constitution. Appreciate how America has become more inclusive over time, and by experiencing the world firsthand and interacting with folks unlike yourself, maybe more inequalities will become apparent. Third, cultivate a global perspective. It's important to understand that America is not an island unto itself. It's part of a larger world. That's non-negotiable. That's just the way it is. What happens halfway around the world has consequences here. What happens here has consequences halfway around the world. Fourth, each of us must do better to get better leaders. If we want better leaders, then we must hold ourselves to a higher standard. Set an example of leadership wherever you are. You're a leader too. You can be a leader if you're a student in your classroom. If you're in the office, my God, offices need leaders. They need folks who will do the right thing. Don't gossip. Don't lie. There's a million things that you can do to be a better leader where you're at. If you have a book club, be a good leader in the book club. And in your home, to those of us raising children and grandchildren, remember we're raising the next generation of leaders. How about we cultivate the positive characteristics we want to see in statesmen? Characteristics like honesty, humility, moral courage, personal responsibility. It's kind of hokey sometimes when we talk about those things, but those are the fundamental characteristics that what we want to see in our leaders. And fifth, I encourage each of you, think about this. This is hard for some folks. Don't be a slave to partisan politics. Where do you stand on an issue? Name an issue. Don't check first with your political party of choice to figure out what you think about that issue. Maybe just consult your own mind first. Think for yourself and think critically. Think about how whatever issue affects the world. How does it affect your country? How does it affect your state, your community, your family, you, and the next generation? If where you stand on a political issue means you're out of step with your political party, good for you. And have the courage to hold on to that. Be on the right side of history. History will remember you kindly if you're on the right side. And finally, here's my last piece of advice. How can we get better leaders? How can we get more statesmen? Notice I've only talked about how we can improve ourselves so far. That's by design. Because you're all the potential future leaders. Don't look to others and expect to magically find a statesman that's going to come along and solve all your problems. It's probably not going to happen. Instead, cultivate statesman-like characteristics within yourself. You could emerge as the next Lincoln. But at the very least, and this is a good goal for us at the Bicentennial, at the very least, if you do that, you're going to improve the world around you, and that's what we need more than ever. Thank you all very much for listening. Appreciate it. All right, we got time for a couple questions. Anybody have any questions or comments? This is a talk that's, I hope, accessible, that you all can speak your mind.
What was one of the greatest things Lincoln did outside of the emancipation freeing slaves?
So the question is, what was the greatest thing Lincoln did outside of emancipating the slaves,
Yes.
ending slavery? It's keeping the Union together. I mean, those are the big ones.
The vote.
What?
He was suggested not to hold the elections as foreign countries did during times of crisis.
Ah, okay.
And he
So it wasn't a
said,
question, it was a comment.
he said to vote.
Yeah.
Hold the elections in 4 years, the 4-year cycle, and to maintain the vote. Get as many people to vote is the most important thing.
So you're referring to the election of 1864, right? The most remarkable thing about the election of 1864 is that it happened. It's the middle of the Civil War, and we have a election that takes place where Lincoln, it looks like, all the way up to September of that electoral year, he's not going to be reelected. There's also a real fear that he's not even going to be the nominee. Had to be such a stressful time. Of course, the fall of Atlanta, etc. The rest is history. It's a blowout in terms of an electoral victory against General George McClellan. But it is important to remember that context. History has a way of making things not a big deal because we know how it turns out. But yeah, that election is remarkable in so many ways, and one of the most racist elections in American history too. Any other comments? Yes, sir.
In your description of statesmanship, one of the things you mentioned was holding firm to principles.
Yes.
And another thing you mentioned was the power of persuasion. Those two things at some level seem somewhat antithetical in terms of the more firmly we hold the principles, the less susceptible we are to persuasion by others. I very much appreciate your thoughts about how those two work together such that we don't wind up with highly partisan situations, whether they're principled or not.
Yeah. So one of the points in our exhibit where we're looking at these four Illinois presidents and we're trying to find commonalities. What's an interesting way that we can tell their story? My favorite section in the exhibit is called Great Communicators. Each of these four individuals has a remarkable ability to communicate their agenda to the American people. Now, when I talked about the qualities that make a excellent statesman, I did talk about they stand firm on principle. Their vision for the country is rooted in very firm principles that are American principles. And then I also talked about the ability to persuade. And what I mean by that, I think in terms of being a good communicator, and certainly a statesman has to have this ability, it's to clearly articulate what are the principles they're standing firm on. If they've carved out a policy that's maybe not extremely popular, it's so important to articulate where that comes from. Because if it's rooted in principle, they can make connections back to American history, the founding of the country. They can talk about how this is good in line with not just the founders, but also good as they project out to the future of the country. Part of being a good politician, a statesman, there's a lot of education that has to take place, and I mean from the podium. They have to bring their audience along. They have to bring the voter along so they begin seeing the future of this country the way that the statesman sees it. That's more of what I was talking about, not necessarily any trickery or anything like that. I think that's reserved for those attack ads and those slick PR campaigns, but really great communication, classic communication is really the written word and being a good orator. All right. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
I won't move anymore. Sam, well, thank you so much for actually a wonderful talk, really thoughtful remarks, which will, in the course of this year, we're working hard on the Statesmanship initiative, but I think a lot of the comments you made will really help us focus in on this concept, which is used a lot, but oftentimes not thought about real precisely. So thank you so much for making the trek back home to Carbondale. And I urge everyone who can to go to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library because it's a remarkable place to visit and spend time. So Sam Wheeler, thank you so very much.